Good afternoon. My name's Dan Terrace. I'm director of the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life. And I am very, very happy to welcome you to the first part of the 20th anniversary celebration for the center. We've planned today's activities to kind of reflect the kind of elements and practices of the center as built up over the past 20 years. And so we'll have some discussion and conversation, we'll have some parties and tributes, and then we'll have some performance that connect to our work on peace building and the arts in the evening. So we have an exciting and full day of activities. The International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life was indeed founded in 1998. And over the past 20 years, I think the hallmark of our work has been the creation of projects and programs at the border of academic life and professional life. We're really proud of having built those bridges between what happens at the Brandeis University campus and other campuses around the world, and networks of communities, whether they're international judges, people working on issues of peace building, people working on state legislation, on labor issues, on a variety of things that the center takes on. And I really like to think that we have tried to build this center collectively, drawing on the talents of our own staff, on the faculty, on the administration, on the students of this university, as well as colleagues and friends from outside. And I also like to think that we are kind of in the center of how Brandeis University as an institution does things. That is to say, to build partnerships within and outside of the academy. And our center is really engaged in, above everything else, in the production and dissemination of knowledge, which is indeed the mission of the university of which we're a part. We really believe that knowledge is produced through conversations among people with informed and diverse perspectives. And one of the hallmarks of our work has been the convening of conversations among diverse groups of people of professional background to create new knowledge through conversation. And so our panel today really tries to reflect the kinds of programs that we have done with international judges, with people working on peace building and the arts, what we've done with students through our Sorensen Fellowship program. And so our conversation today, which takes on some big questions, as I say, replicates that format. We're bringing friends and colleagues and new voices together, providing the space for the conversation. So today, to discuss the big topic, Democracies in Peril, the role of higher education, we've gathered a group of students, faculty members, leaders of the university, members of the center's board, friends from outside of the university, to really tackle together the worldwide issues involving democratic values, to discuss the extent to which they are under threat in today's world, and to discuss and debate perhaps what the appropriate role is for higher education, for this university, for our center, and for other communities that are engaged in the process of education itself. And so over the next couple of hours, we'll have a conversation, an interactive conversation among the folks up here. We'll try to have some time for comments and questions from those in the audience who we expect a bit to come and go on a busy Monday afternoon. And we'll move between a series of subtopics underneath this broad theme of democracies in peril to be able to move the conversation along. John Shattuck, to my right, the chair of our center's board, will kick us off in a couple of minutes with some opening remarks, and then we'll just proceed with our conversation. A couple of words about format. We have a large group of discussants in order to kind of manage the conversation for me as the moderator, I'm going to ask our discussants, when you're kind of ready to intervene, when you have something you'd like to say, take your tent card, invert it like this in front of you, and I'll be keeping an eye on it and keeping a list, and we'll try to move through it. Now, I may take the privilege as moderator sometimes of interrupting the formal list in order to bring somebody else in or to explore a theme, but I'll try to make sure everybody has a chance to get in. Now, I don't want to disrupt the possibility of immediate exchange, and especially want to encourage that if there are points of disagreement, that we shouldn't bury them or wait a half an hour to bring them to the surface. So if you hear something that you feel like you need to respond to more quickly, it's perfectly fine to get my attention by waving your tent card, and I will try to recognize you as long as you don't abuse the privilege, and encourage some back and forth as the opportunity arises. I would ask you, the discussants, and it would apply to anybody in the audience who may speak too, that to try to keep comments to no more than 2 or 3 minutes at the tops. Otherwise, we really won't have the nature of interactive conversation, and we'll try to come back to you if that inevitably may not be enough for you to say everything you'd like to. Lee Swigert, my colleague from the center, has agreed to provide just before our break and just before the end of the session, not a comprehensive summary of what's said, but try to lift up some of the themes that have emerged in our conversation, and that will be good. Of course, this is also being recorded, and we'll, in various ways, make this available for our own use as a center. I hope for the Brandeis community as well, as something to think about as for us as an institution, and of course for those outside as well. A couple of things for us to keep in mind as we discuss today. One is that we did deliberately call this panel Democracies in Peril, not Democracy in Peril, because we are an international center and we want to think about these issues both in terms of the United States, but also in terms of other places in the world. Secondly, we want to make sure that as we think about the role of higher education, we're always tempted to pat ourselves in the back and think of ourselves as universities as part of the solution, and we should be part of the solution to world problems, but sometimes we're part of the problem. And we should recognize that and try to face that, I think, as part of our conversation today. And finally, just a reminder again, in the spirit of the waving of the tent cards, that respectful disagreement is at the heart of democratic practice. So if we don't have any as part of our conversation today, we'll be failing ourselves in some way. So let's see if we can get a variety of perspectives on the table. I'm not going to do biographies of all of our panelists. You have at least a short one-liner on the sheets in the room. What I will do, though, is maybe just ask each of you to say your names, because not everybody may be able to read your tent card from afar, and then they can refer to your bio there. So, David, if I can ask you to start.
Sure. I'm David Chard.
I'm Maria Levinson.
I'm Jacob Edelman.
I'm Hila Perez.
Elaine Rubin.
Lisa Lynch.
Dan Terrace.
John Shattuck.
Maria Madison.
Gordie Fellman.
Elaine Wong.
Jay Kaufman.
Raj Sampath.
Leah Sussman.
Great, thank you all. And with that, as I said, I'm not going to give bios of everybody, but I did ask John Shattuck as our chair to make opening remarks, in part because he brings a rich combination of experience as a civil rights lawyer, as a leading figure on human rights in the State Department, and as the former president of a university under threat from an authoritarian regime. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to John Shattuck to get our substantive conversation kicked off. John.
Thank you, Dan. And I suppose, start by saying happy birthday to the center. This is, after all, a celebration of the Center's 20th anniversary, and I'm delighted that we could all be here and hold off the snow for another few hours until we manage to celebrate. I also want to particularly pay tribute to my predecessor, who's here today, Richard Goldstone. All of you know, distinguished South African justice and international leader in international justice in many different dimensions, and I have the privilege of succeeding Richard as chair of this board. So Richard, thank you. And greetings to Lisa Lynch, who's a friend and of course the provost of the university. Thank you, Lisa. And I can't resist noticing Ira Jackson, who's in the audience. We haven't seen each other for probably 25 years. He hasn't changed one bit. I'm not going to allow him to comment. He gets no right of rebuttal on either that or commenting on me. So there it is.
It's hard to imagine with Ira.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens later. Yes, let me make just a few opening comments about this. Dan has asked me to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, but I may not need to spend that much time. Some of what I'm going to tell you is very familiar to you, and you may nod your heads and say, yes, this is what's happening. Other things that I will tell you either won't be familiar or you may be in some disagreement, but we'll see whether that happens. You know, I come to this subject, Democracies in Peril, with a little bit of a resume, as you've just heard from Dan, having recently been the president of Central European University in Budapest, Hungary, and we'll get a little more into what's happening in Budapest in a minute. But just a word first to introduce you to this university. It's a university that was founded after the fall of the Berlin Wall with a very express mission of reviving intellectual freedom and bringing a new academic excellence to a part of the world, and I think we all know that, and the only part of the world that was successively dominated by the two totalitarian systems of the 20th century, fascism and communism, and that is Eastern Europe, but particularly Hungary, Poland, then Czechoslovakia, the other countries in the region. And while I was president, we really redefined or restated the mission as a university on the frontiers of democracy. That was literally what we called ourselves. Little did we know, as time went on, and I became president in 2009, and then in 2010, Viktor Orban, who I'll say a little bit more about, was elected. The frontiers of democracy was a word that meant more than one, had more than one meaning, because in fact, it turned out that the very place that we were, not just what was going on further to the east, was a frontier of democracy. And a new anti-democratic nationalism really sprang up in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Hungary. It was fueled by the economic crisis, which of course caused havoc across the world, but particularly left behind many of the people in Eastern Europe. And then later on was fed by the migration crisis as more refugees were coming into Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, escaping from the horrors going on in the Middle East, and particularly in Syria. Now, Viktor Orban, who was the politician who rose out of this environment, played on all the popular fears that were stimulated by the economic crisis and the migration crisis, and he defined what he called very openly illiberal democracy. By that he meant, I don't want anything to do with all of these institutions of democracy that are holding it back from being an efficient system. I don't want an independent judiciary. I don't want an independent media. I don't want any of these other things. However, we are a democracy because I've been elected. And his approach, which initially was seen to be kind of a toxic, something quite different from what was going on in the rest of Europe, ended up being mimicked by populist leaders in Poland, Austria, France. We all know the story of Marine Le Pen, of course, who was defeated, but nonetheless represents this. And now, perhaps most powerfully and immediately, in Italy. Italy has just basically fallen prey to this system. So I returned to the United States in 2016, and my friends, many of my friends, sort of said, well, you must be a democracy disease carrier. What's going on here? Because there was another event, you may recall, that happened in the fall of 2016, actually right here. So once again, the frontiers of democracy moved further west. Now, hopefully I'm not a carrier, but I am a close observer of the threats to democracy on both sides of the Atlantic. So now, why does democracy matter? I think we should really start this discussion by having a little bit of quick reminder of why it matters. It's messy, it's inefficient, it's slow. It often doesn't get things done. It drives people crazy. They aren't able to accomplish anything in Washington or elsewhere. And of course, it's what Winston Churchill famously described as the worst form of government, apart from all the others, as he said. So what do we mean by democracy? Well, certainly where I was in Central Europe, it was a bulwark against totalitarianism. It was an institutionalized defense of freedom after 1989, with these two totalitarian systems having dominated that part of the world. It is, after all, and I think we don't have to be idealistic about it, that's what it is. It's a form of government in which citizens determine and participate in their own governance. Sounds quite simple and unobjectionable. And by doing so, they have to have various institutions to back that up. Free and fair elections, intellectual freedom and freedoms of speech and association, minority rights and civil liberties, the rule of law and an independent judiciary, checks and balances against the abuses of power, and above all, and this is something that I think remains strong very much in the United States, is a free civil society, where the engine of democracy really exists. So how did all this come under attack? What happened? I've given you a little thumbnail about what happened in Hungary. What happened here? I certainly can't answer that question in the very brief time that we have, but let me just cite a few polling numbers, which I think are quite disturbing. Over 15 years, really starting around 2002, there was a growing public discontent with the functioning of American democracy, reflected in the standard polls. The 2002 Gallup poll showed that 68% of Americans were satisfied with the U.S. system of government. That was the question that they were answered, almost 70%. In 2014, there was a total reversal. 65% of those who responded to the Gallup poll found that they were fundamentally dissatisfied with the U.S. and its system of government, the U.S. system of government. There was an even higher level of dissatisfaction reflected in that same year in Europe, 68%. And last October, the Washington Post and University of Maryland did a poll that showed that 71% of Americans now believe, and this is a bipartisan group in that respect, that political polarization and government dysfunction are at a dangerous low point. Now, let's look at this discontent for a minute. What's this all about? I think, myself, that it reflects a major backlash against the great social and economic revolutions of the last 50 years. The Civil Rights Revolution, of course, transformed American society, promoting pluralism and diversity. But at the same time, slowly, and this has gathered momentum over time, it sparked a counter-revolution by majorities, and as we know most recently from the voting in 2016, particularly by white males who felt threatened by this great social transformation, which we, of course, celebrate all the time. The second great revolution was, in a sense, a revolution on the right, the economic revolution, the deregulation of the market so that it becomes, under the theories of deregulation, an engine of economic growth and opportunity, and it's not held back by the government regulations. But this, of course, has led over time famously to globalization, to growing economic inequality, and politically to resentment by those left behind. And there are many in that category who are both on the left and on the right. So this is a nonpartisan observation. And these backlashes, this backlash turned into political rebellion, two types of rebellion, very specific, which are fueling the populist nationalism that's working today. Certainly a rebellion by old majorities who were lashing out at the culture of diversity and the role of government and elites in promoting it. And by elites, of course, we mean universities, we mean intellectuals, we mean the media, we mean all of these various engines of cultural change and transformation. And the rebellion against that is a cultural rebellion. Then the economic rebellion by people who were left behind by the loss of jobs and by moving of industries and new technologies and lower standards of living. And this economic rebellion is, at least theoretically, reaching into those very elements of what we now call the Trump constituency, but that constituency has essentially picked up and given its support to the populist nationalism, when in fact you would not necessarily expect it to do so, given the origins of that economic revolution that I spoke about earlier, which is essentially deregulation. So out of these rebellions came the rise of a new form of anti-democratic leadership, which was remarkably using the very instruments of democracy to attack democracy. And that, in fact, is what happened with Viktor Orban and Donald Trump and other opportunistic neo-authoritarian politicians in Europe and the United States who have manipulated public fears and anxieties very effectively that were reflected in these populist rebellions. They have attacked elites very effectively and minorities, especially immigrants and refugees, whom they charged with making life worse for the majority, for the reasons that all came about. Both Orban and Trump have specialized in demagogic, xenophobic, and racist tactics. Orban has famously offered himself as a defender of what he calls the Christian Europe against an invasion by Muslim refugees, with many anti-pluralist elements of that aimed not just at Muslims. And Trump, of course, has said famously that he would build the wall to keep out all the hordes from Mexico, as we know. So this illiberal democracy model that Orban projected back in 2009 when I first went to Central European University has indeed become a disease and is reached very much our land. And you know, what we have is the undermining of pluralist institutions that stand in the way of this kind of a leadership. Free media, independent judiciary, rule of law, civil society, including universities, civil liberties, not necessarily yet happening here, but certainly happening where I've come from in Eastern Europe. And what's left in this is really the shell of democracy, an election and a continuing set of elections with no democratic institutions. Now in the US, I think things are quite a bit more complicated. I think there are three different and somewhat conflicting models of the Trump presidency. We have the authoritarian model, where I don't think he's necessarily doing so well. You may disagree with this. That's the model of essentially trying to rule by executive order, attacking pluralist institutions like the media, and essentially trying to become a neo-authoritarian and testing these liberal democratic institutions to see how they might respond. Not so successful. I'd give him a C at best in that. Anti-government model is the second one. It's rather different from authoritarian. You can't be an authoritarian and be against government, but he is. He's an authoritarian who's trying to tear the government apart. You've heard about the deep state and all the elements of the deep state that are projected by, you know, Bannon and others as essentially the enemy of the democratic populism that Trump represents. Dismantling agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, defunding functions like diplomacy and the State Department, deregulating the financial industry. Now here I would give Trump more like a B. I think he's done somewhat better on the issues being an anti-government president, and damage is quite serious. The third Trump, which is probably where he's most successful, is Trump as a populist divider, where he is constantly appealing to his base by making racist and xenophobic attacks, stirring division and polarization, and undermining norms of democratic governance and just basic civility, how people should talk to each other in a democracy. There, I don't want to give him a grade yet. It's incomplete. Thank goodness that it's incomplete, but he's doing considerably better. And the tactics that are common to all three of these models, I think we see attacks on voting rights, charging fraud in various ways, imposing new technical requirements on voters, which is happening at the state level, gerrymandering legislative districts, that's certainly happening at the state level in order to dilute the voting strength of the opposition, preventing any regulation of campaign finance or political funding, so enormous amounts of funding is flowing into the system constantly to promote these various kinds of illiberal governance, attacks on the media, promoting false information, and polarizing political parties. So these are the tactics that are being used, and they are being used elsewhere. It's not just the United States, to be sure. So let me just conclude with two comments. First comment is about democracy, and the second comment is about universities. Democracy. How resilient is liberal democracy? I described it to you earlier. It has these various institutional forms of protection of democracy. It consists obviously of the media and the independent judiciary and all these various other elements that I've been talking about. Now, in Eastern Europe, not resilient at all. And this is the tragedy. Here we are, a quarter of a century after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and these new institutions, new for Central Europe, of liberal democracy have not quite yet taken hold, and then they've been overwhelmed by economic disorder and the migration flow. And so you have a relatively easy road for some of the neo-authoritarians in Eastern Europe. Probably the easiest of all is the further east you go. If you go to Russia, we know what that situation is like. I wouldn't give up on democracy in Eastern Europe, but I think the question of resilience is a much more difficult one to answer than it is for the United States. Because here I'll give you a little bit of optimism, which you may disagree with. I actually think American democracy is quite resilient, and I think it will revive, and it is in the process of reviving even as we speak. We certainly know it has deep roots. 250 years of democratic governance. It also has plenty of examples of recent presidents in our own lifetimes, and some of us have even participated in this effort, who have been pulled up short when they've been attacking American democracy. Just to be bipartisan about it, I would start with Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, when he tried to pack the Supreme Court of the United States with justices that could approve the New Deal, he was pushed back. He was pushed back by the Congress, by civil society and others, and he wasn't able to pack the courts. Richard Nixon, I don't need to recount his tale for you. You know it well. I'd also cite George W. Bush, who tried to impose a new system of torture in the counterterrorism activities, and he was eventually pushed back by the Congress and the courts. So we have a lot of institutions in the United States, in addition to those that have participated in pushing back presidential abuse, who I think have a great deal of resilience. I would start with state and local, or mention, I'm not going to go into any depth, state and local government. We live in a federal system. It's a multi-layered system. There are now 19 states that have adopted the Paris climate change standards. There are about 12 states that are suing the United States government or trying to stop, and if with some success succeeded in stopping some of the anti-Muslim immigration bans that have been imposed. We have a federal judiciary which is certainly vulnerable to presidential attack in the sense that the president has the right to appoint and nominate at least new federal judges. And Trump has already made 77 nominations and is filling 23 positions, but that's a normal functioning of democracy. We don't like some of these judges, et cetera. But if you look at the role and performance of the federal judiciary over the last year, it's actually been quite remarkable in challenging illegal and unconstitutional actions by the president on immigration, on voting, and even in some areas on the environment. So, I think there's a pushback. The civil service is proving to be remarkably resilient, and probably nowhere more so than in federal law enforcement. I mean, who would have thought we would have this standoff between the Justice Department and the FBI on the one hand, even though we don't like a lot of things that the Justice Department is doing in other areas, and the White House on the other hand, over the issue of the meddling the Russian meddling in the elections and the potential White House obstruction of justice. But there are plenty of other elements of the deep state that are significantly pushing back. The media is pushing back. It's proving to be remarkably strong, and it's even had a slight uptick in public trust in the polls in the last year, increased circulation of the mainstream media. Sure, there are polarizing elements of the media, the rise of Breitbart and Fox News and all the rest we know very well, but I don't think anyone could really say that the media is less vibrant today than it was a year ago. And civil society certainly, in just so many different dimensions, is engaged in pushing back, and probably the most important dimension is going to be the upcoming 2018 elections, midterm elections, the efforts to get out the vote, the remarkable number of new candidates who have emerged who want to run for office, some of the elements of the off-year voting that has taken place already. So, I am guardedly optimistic that unlike Central and Eastern Europe, there is a resilience in American democracy, and anybody who's interested in more of this, I've written a long report for Harvard, which is published last month. It's available. We could make it to you available. Final word about the university, because I know that's really where most of the panel is going to be focused. So I think there are a number of things universities can and should be doing, but I think above all you have to start with the proposition that universities, at least as currently self-defined, are part of the elite that is being attacked, and quite successfully so, by the populist nationalist elements represented not just by Trump and Orban and others, but much broader representation. So the university has, above all, a role of teaching and demonstrating pluralism and democratic values and social engagement, but not doing so in a kind of reflexive, politically correct way, but rather stimulating real debates inside the university about some of the issues, not just the tactics, but the underlying questions that I talked about earlier. What was the civil rights revolution? And what was the economic revolution? I think the most practical thing that universities need to do, and can do, certainly, is to encourage students to vote. Voting is probably the single most important element of potential resilience by American democracy, but the numbers are pathetic. We know them. Only 18% of college students voted in the 2014 elections, which is less than half of and of course the turnout for midterm elections is generally not very good anyway, but less than half of the public at large. So voting is essential, and we need to find ways for universities, and I think they quite rightly can play the role in educating and pushing forth students to participate by voting. Defending academic freedom is clearly a crucial issue, including from various kinds of threats from within. At Berkeley, where I'm now teaching, at least temporarily, there have been major attacks on the university from the left for allowing right-wing speakers to come and participate, or the left, which is trying to shout down speakers. So we're back to the old days of whether people have a right to speak at a university. That shouldn't be the case. Universities need to stand up and defend that. Defending university autonomy is obviously very important. And here, difficult situation. American universities are not under threat yet, at least from some authoritarian regime. But what they are under constant threat and pressure from is their benefactors. We need benefactors. There's no way to run a university without them. And we need public benefactors and private benefactors. But we need to make sure that the university is able to resist efforts by benefactors to push universities to take particular positions or to teach specific areas. So I guess let me just conclude with a very brief quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, who we know is one of the great observers of American democracy, who said in 1835 that the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to correct and repair her faults. I thought that was I just found that. It was a fascinating quote to come across. I mean, Tocqueville has thought about writing about civil society, et cetera, but he says it's not that it's the greatest system. It may not be, but it has the capacity to repair itself. So I would just conclude by saying I hope that Tocqueville's observation proves correct today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that pithy, substantive, stimulating account of what's happening with democracy today, and begin pointing us towards our questions about the role of higher education. That's great. One quick logistical thing, David, maybe you're about to do this. Would you mind bringing a few more chairs out to make it easier and rescue from folks from behind the coffee machine there? Thank you. Great. Well, the way we've organized ourselves, and John has kind of teed us up beautifully for this, is we kind of think of this discussion as in two parts. One is more or less about the question of the role that universities should be playing in relation to these threats to democracy that John has outlined so brilliantly. And the other part of our conversation will actually think about the ways in which this larger climate threatens universities themselves internally, and how we need to think about it. Now, these topics may bleed a little bit into each other, but I'm going to, and we'll have some subtopics and sets of questions within that will help kind of organize us. So I'm going to start by raising the first set of sub-questions that really draws right on what John was asking us to think about. I believe Richard Goldstone is going to make some initial comments in relation to this first set of questions, but I invite others to start putting up your tent cards as you want to intervene. And so our really first set of questions is, do you share John's view that democratic institutions, especially in Europe, are really under threat today, and the democratic institutions in the United States are also under threat? And the question is, if so, what is the part that universities have to play in responding to those threats? John's outlined a few things. He's asked us to think about more our own role as elites and to encourage more debate not in a less reflexive, politically correct way. I think he's given us a lot of room to figure out exactly what that means. He's asked us to encourage students to vote. I think we could ask whether that's an appropriate role for universities, and if so, how we would go about it. He's also asked us to think about issues of university autonomy and our relation to benefactors. So a lot to chew on as we think of how universities respond to these issues. So I'm going to start, Richard, with some comments from you, and then others I think will start to let themselves be known.
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks, John, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. There's so much that one could respond to, but I'm going to limit myself to two or three points. The first is, I think one must recognize that at the heart of democracy is the rule of law. And the rule of law includes that democracy is not majoritarianism. Governments, everybody, are subject to the law, which means the Constitution in particular as the supreme law, and that even 100% of the people cannot do things that are inconsistent with the Bill of Rights. So there's a limit on what the majority can do, and that's often overlooked, I would suggest, in the reaction of people, especially majorities, saying, well, we're the majority and we can do what we like. And I think I think Orban and people like him fall to an extent into that category. The role of the media clearly is crucial, and it's the reason that in undemocratic societies, including illiberal democracies, the first attack is usually made on the media. And for good reason. The media is seen as the enemy of illiberalism and of people like Orban, and to an extent President Trump too, who see the media as the enemy, and they say so. They call it the enemy. And the danger, of course, is not so much that it's shutting the mouths of the media. They're much more brave than that and courageous than that. But the problem, it seems to me, is that these attacks on the media has the effect for many people of weakening their trust in the media. And that's an illness that needs to be corrected, and I think it's here that the universities can play an important role. I think the universities of all organisms in society have the ability and have the duty to encourage open exchanges of views and force people to listen to things they don't agree with. I hate listening to Fox News. I much prefer watching CNN. But as part of my daily diet, I force myself to spend as many few minutes as I can watching the sort of stuff that I disagree with every word. But I think it's important for all of us to know what is being said on the other side. And I think too few people are doing that. And I think it's a role, as I say, that the universities can play. And I think they need to wake up to it. I think on too many campuses there's the same polarization and there's the same intolerance of views that they don't agree with. The other point I want to make is the deeply regretful fact that the United States is losing and has lost to an extent its leadership of the democratic world. I know when I was growing up in apartheid South Africa, it was really the United States that we looked to for the lead. Not only in the civil rights movement, but generally in the way the United States democracy was working. It was something that people who wanted freedom in South Africa aspired to, and I think that example has to an extent receded. And that, of course, is a pity. Let me end with a couple of remarks about my own country, South Africa. We've just survived a terrible 9 years of the presidency of Jacob Zuma, who was involved in the worst corruption that our country has seen. And it was only because of the free media and freedom of expression and losing many votes in the last election because of what was being made public, that the ruling party was forced, really, for its own self-preservation, to kick Zuma out, and it did so. And it wouldn't have been able to do so if what he was doing hadn't been made public by a courageous media, by parliamentary inquiries themselves. So I think here you have a situation where South Africa could have gone more deeply into an undemocratic sort of situation that too many African countries have succumbed to, including our neighbour Zimbabwe. But fortunately we didn't, and I believe that there are three reasons for that. One is the media. Two is the independence of the judiciary, which has been very important in bringing out very, very serious findings against Zuma, accusing him of acting unconstitutionally. And thirdly, the civil society generally rising out and using the courts to shine the light on what Zuma was doing. So here I think I'm optimistic. Generally speaking, I share John's optimism. I've got little doubt that the United States will regain in the foreseeable future its leadership of the free and democratic world. And I'm optimistic, particularly, that South Africa has entered into a period of renewal, a new dawn, as our new President Ramaphosa has put it. So I think for countries that take democracy seriously and have the constitution and the institutions, democracy in the end is going to win.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you also for your leadership and involvement with the Center from the very beginning. I'm going to turn next to Lisa Lynch, with also a note of thanks for your support as provost, for the work of the center, and before that as dean of the Heller School. And I'll be curious to hear whether you agree with Richard Goldstone that we should be forcing our students to hear alternative or uncomfortable views.
Thank you. So before I answer that provocative question, I want to focus on a dimension of democratic institutions that hasn't been covered thus far, which I think is very important to understand some of what we see both in the United States and Europe with this sort of growing popularism in countries, from Britain to Germany to Italy to France, et cetera. And that has to do with workplace democracy. When you think about where people spend an enormous amount of the time, it's actually at the workplace. If I think back to the early 1990s, not only was Eastern Europe opening up and there was this sort of euphoria associated with the transformation of those economies, this was also the high point of discussions about self-managed teams, workplace democracy, the role of workers having greater control over their workplace. You zoom forward to today, and we've moved from discussions about self-managed teams to the gig economy, to the loneliness of being a worker, to a worker who doesn't even know who their actual employer is because they're hired by a third-party employment broker. They don't have voice. They don't have representation. You have decline of unionization across all of these countries. And you think back to the end of World War II, unions were a very critical component of the democratization in Europe of nations as they went into Reconstruction because they provided voice for workers. And so how you think about voice, both at the election polls and I would argue also in the workplace, is a very important way of measuring the extent to which your democracy is healthy or not. So from that point of view, I actually have a somewhat more pessimistic view about the current state of the United States and our ability to play that real leading role, because I think, unfortunately, in that sphere, we've been playing the leading role in terms of people losing voice in the workplace as opposed to gaining voice. So what's the role of universities? It's not so much that we force our students to do a particular thing, but I think it's very important for us to train and support our students to learn how to be critical thinkers, to properly to understand how to be informed by this digital media that's coming at them, how they can sort out fact from fiction, how they are good judges of evidence, how they learn how to participate in difficult conversations, how they learn about others that are not the same as themselves, how we bring communities together as opposed to allowing communities to sort of sit in their own echo chambers online. So that's a very important part of universities. And secondly, we are the providers of much of the evidence and scientific knowledge that in turn should be used by policymakers as they're devising appropriate policies. So if we lose that voice, the voice of evidence, of science in public discourse, and we surrender to the battle of rhetoric, universities have failed in their mission as well to inform that discussion. So so a lot for us to do, and I think the jury's still out who's going to actually be the leaders in bringing us back to a healthier place in terms of democracy.
Great, thank you. Lisa, thank you for bringing the voice of the workers in. Raj Sampath, bringing a philosopher's point of view as well as from a public policy school. Lisa has mentioned critical thinking. Richard has said we really need to expose our students to alternative viewpoints. Of course, there are critiques of the university to which John has referred, that we are kind of bastions of ideological conformity ourselves. What do you want to say?
Thank you. Dan, to that last point, I agree with the first part of Lisa's comments about workers and unions, but I want to challenge Lisa's perspective on the critical thinking in light of an increasingly diverse country, most Western countries, and therefore universities. But then Lisa's challenges to both John and Richard. I was in an airport 2 weeks ago, and the cover of a Newsweek magazine said, "The war on college. Tired of whiny brats and rising tuition costs, burn it down, and this is what we can do to start over." So that's part of that democratic populism, the stuff that you see on Fox and Breitbart. What's happening in the academy? They might say universities in peril, and what's the role of democracy? So the inverse of our title. I want to look at some of the demographic changes that are taking place, and they're quite remarkable, how fast some societies are diversifying. CNN was quoting a Brookings report recently that post-millennials, people under the age of 18, so incoming freshmen, for example, millennials, people of ages of 18 to 34, majority women, graduate schools too now, not just undergraduate. So you think about that convergence of gender rights and diversity and race. 51% of people 18 and under across the country now, not just a few states. That's the white population. So the other side, African American, Latino American, Asian American, those groups are growing much faster, multiracialism. So the challenges going forward when you think about this acceleration of diversity, millennials, quite frankly, 55% white, people over the age of 55, 70% white. We've accelerated to a point that we thought we'd get to 10, 15 years from now. It's already here. So on the one hand, we have this sacrosanct view that the university, in its spirit, has to defend the pursuit of truth through science. I agree with that. I mean, that's what it means to be in the ivory tower. We're protected from the vicissitudes of society to rise above and to be forward thinkers, to understand and unpack what people are not allowed to think in the real world out of fear of ideological conformity or fear within their own systems, especially if they don't live in democracies. We have that freedom, and we should protect that. But on the other hand, we have an increasing pluralism and diversity in which we have to strike a balance between individual rights and group rights. Groups feel unprotected in the academy. When the student body diversifies and the leadership and the professoriate doesn't keep up with that diversification, There's an imbalance there that we have to strike while we maintain this pursuit of truth. So equality and liberty at the individual level, of course, that's the backbone of democracy. But being forward thinkers to deconstruct the ideological conformity on the outside, perhaps on the inside, means we also have to reckon the fact that the pursuit of truth, as John Rawls says, what truth is to systems of thought, justice is the basic idea of society. I don't think both democracies and universities can succeed in the future symbiotically if they don't perhaps revolutionize the way they think about the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of justice in some kind of relationality, as opposed to seeing that in terms of a trade-off. And that has everything to do with how we're going to reflect on our own diversity.
Thanks, Raj, and thanks for bringing that element of our own diverse populations into the discussion. I'll turn next to Gordie Fellman, involved with the Center from the very beginning and bringing the perspective of someone involved in peace issues internationally as well as domestically. Gordie.
Okay, I want to speak to the issue of media that's come up already. We know that people like Trump and Orban attack the media, want to undermine the media for their own fairly obvious purposes. I want to draw three issues that I have with the media that come from a different direction. It was either right at the end of the presidential campaign or right after that the head of CBS News was asked, why did they publicize Trump so much? Why did they give him so much coverage? He said, because we made a lot of money off it. That's why we did it. Now that's important, isn't it? The media are not just there reporting, they're making money. And there was more money to be made off Trump than off Sanders. Sanders had a lot more to say, actually, with this interesting. So that's my one point. Second point is, from Ronald Reagan on, the media have often called people conservative, who I think are more appropriately called reactionary. We don't call the people in office right now conservative. They're not trying to conserve health care or health insurance or the First Amendment or Social Security. They're reactionary. They want to turn things back. They want to get women back in the kitchen. They want to get blacks back on the plantation, gays back in the closet. So I think that use of conservative is incorrect. It's too gentle, and it takes attention off the drastic agenda to turn things back to some mythological state, which was horrible.
Gordie, should we be asking, as Richard suggested?
And the third is, Steve Bannon now is on a tour of Europe, and I read somebody yesterday who said, why did the media call Bannon a populist? He's a fascist. So I'm worrying about the words that media use, and we can criticize them too, not for the same reason Trump does or the same reason Orban does, but I've been disappointed in the media's under-critical responses to what's going on. Not always, of course. I do want to speak to John Shattuck's comment about the resiliency of democracy too. I think it's phenomenal that the day after that inauguration, there was the biggest march in history, right? Women all over the country. That was extraordinary. I think Black Lives Matter is part of the resilience of American democracy. I think Me Too is a good part of the resilience of American democracy. I think I think these kids in Parkland are fantastic. They are just fantastic. It's been pointed out by a black observer that would they get the attention they're getting now if they weren't white? We'll set that aside, but they are getting attention, and they're organizing rapidly. I find that important. And so on, that we have an unprecedented number of women running for office right now in this country. We have, there's a lot going on that I feel hopeful about too. Whether it can come together, I don't know. But I see in the polls that in Texas, Democrats seem to be coming up. In Texas, there's a lot going on here, but I do want to just go back to my disturbing reaction to the media not using words, I think, properly in crucial cases.
And Gordie, whatever we call those figures, do you think we at universities, as Richard was suggesting, should be making more of an effort to bring these conservative or reactionary voices to campus?
Well, I think
in the service of democracy?
They are, and the media should not be so. I mean, there's always that effort to, let's make Richard Spencer into kind of a kind guy who's just trying to educate people or something like that. That's not the way it goes. I have other things to say, but that's enough right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Elaine, you want to weigh in on this point? Okay.
This isn't what I planned to say, but speaking in response to a couple comments, I'm troubled at the way even here we're using the term politically correct. It evolved in my experience as an insult to people trying to protect individual and collective rights and trying to establish some new cultural norms. And it's now, I think, worth looking at again as what that term ought to mean and whether we ought to be using it. Similarly, I understand exactly Richard's point, I believe I do, about being exposed to other media and other topics and other speakers. I think I'd like to see a distinction made between being exposed to and accepting. And in a way, to turn to Lisa's comment about teaching a kind of literacy or having modes for a kind of literacy, there are, I mean, if there are facts in the world, there are facts that are being abused, whether they're about the nature of fetuses and their susceptibility to pain, whether they're about climate change, whether they're about the impact of immigrants on the economy. And one of the delights of, recent months or years now has been the fact checker mode that some of the major newspapers and other media have brought to us. Somehow or other, we need to have that as a model rather than denouncing the politically correct. We need to be talking about the factually correct. And there certainly aren't enough facts yet without becoming a very deeply trained philosopher to help us understand what's going on. I guess the only other quick comment I would like to make, I've been getting some invitations from several of the networks I'm part of that are about get out the vote efforts and community organizing efforts and the kind of groups that are not just supporting a campaign, but supporting a continuing development in a community that will be there after this season and there for the future. And I was intrigued to see a report, and I can't cite it because I couldn't find it again, but it was about some of the Big Ten type schools that are competing on voter registration and that are really setting up systems. And there are some C3, some organizations that are now helping to provide those kind of materials. I'm sorry, what are you waving? And so, I mean, in a way, it's patronizing. It's kind of in loco parentis, we're going to teach you how to be a grown-up, but it seems that it's absolutely necessary. And there are ways to revive the League of Women Voters or some mode that is capable of putting out material about an election without being partisan, but with being about citizen development.
Great, thank you, Elaine. It looked like Leah was waving to get the student voice in with some urgency, and then we'll go back to our list with Maria.
Yeah, so I would just echo a lot of what Elaine was saying, especially with the term of political correctness and also social justice warrior. These two terms are used to kind of shut down the alternative perspective, and it's used as a tactic to make it seem like, what Raj was saying about these whiny college students who just want to out-left the next person. And I would also add, in the context of bringing in other perspectives, I would argue that it's really important to make these alternative perspectives heard in the classroom. If we are bringing this in an academic context, that is one thing, but bringing in speakers like Steve Bannon or Yiannopoulos to our universities is not totally an academic move. I think there are 2 points. One, when speakers like Yiannopoulos are being brought to universities, it is not as much of a response to what he is going to, the perspectives that he will bring in, but the understanding that he is there and he will be outing undocumented students and transgender students, which actually could put many students at the university in danger. And beyond that, with you know, the invitation of at the University of Chicago to bringing in Steve Bannon, it almost seems as if this is about, it is not about hearing his perspective as much as it is about, like we know that, I think the professor's name was Zingalis, his purpose was to elicit a conversation on political correctness, or on free speech, not on actually wanting to hear his perspective. And so I think we also need to be careful of who we're giving a platform to, because we also know that many people at the University of Chicago and their institution don't actually support what Bannon is standing for.
Great. Maria Madison, as I turn to you, I want to add another question to our mix, which is the question about whether growing inequality, both within this country and around the world, is one of the contributing factors as a threat to democratic values, and again, whether the universities, particularly perhaps private universities like Brandeis, are part of the problem as well as potentially part of the solution. I know you may also have some responses to what's already been said, but I want to add that to the mix, building on your work on diversity and inclusion in the Heller School.
Thank you. So many thoughts flooding my head on all the prior comments. I would say fundamentally, history matters. And if we put all of our comments into context of history, especially hundreds of years of history, we might change our comments. I've been to Cape Town, I've been to District 6. The last 8 to 9 years might feel like the worst leadership in the history of South Africa, but if you visit District 6, you might have a different perspective. Richard Spencer, I show people quotes of what he said, and I ask them, who do you think said this, and when do you think they said it? Because he says abhorrent things. People usually say, oh my God, he must have said that. That must be someone in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So somehow we have to bring history to the present. And to give an example of what I mean, I worry sometimes that we romanticize the word democracy, and particularly in higher ed. Democracy may be quite resilient, but the democracy that underrepresented minorities or people of color, particularly in this country, have experienced was not the kind of civil society democracy that we would call ethical or moral. And in particular, I think Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, describes that from the beginning of the Constitution through, one always jumps to the modern civil rights era. But the first Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the first time that blacks were considered equal. And yet, when people tried to test a just law, they were thrown in jail. When people just simply tried to sit in public spaces, they were thrown in jail. That was under the Constitution. That was also the same case with the Bill of Rights. There have been 13, 15 civil rights acts. So the modern civil rights era, in and of itself, isn't unified, isn't viewed by everyone as a success. I have lots of examples, but that if we look at least since the 17th century up until today, democracy hasn't actually represented everyone. So if we say resilient, are we saying that, for example, when Nazi Germany was looking for ways to hold Jews back, and they used Jim Crow and the black codes, was that American democracy being exported around the world? So that's one part of it. Another part, and so I think universities and colleges should teach a balanced and deep perspective on the word democracy and how we thought we created it and why we think it's exportable around the world. Another aspect is that the same people who have not been properly represented in our democracy are the same ones who can't even get jobs and wages at the same rate as whites, education at the same rate as their counterparts, transgenerational health or wealth or housing at the same rate as those who have benefited from the Constitution. So how do we get them into higher ed? We're talking about how well people are doing in higher ed, but how do we channel people who in this demographic shift are predominantly at underfunded schools. We've got the shift that Raj spoke about, but if the majority of the population are increasingly minority, and that population is increasingly at underfunded, underperforming schools, how are we in higher elite ed even going to get them to the jobs, the schools, the faculty staff positions, to make this an American democracy that is resilient but also worthy of exporting around the world?
Thank you, Maria, for that powerful statement about complicating our easy romanticization of democracy. Jay and Elaine, I'm going to interrupt the list just for a moment because I know Maria Levinson wanted also to speak to this issue of the question of inequality and diversity in relation to our topic. So, Maria, I'm going to turn to you next.
Thanks. Maria, I would like to follow up on what you were talking about, because I think that if we don't focus on the growing inequality, we really are losing a significant part of what our university can make a contribution to. The fact of the matter is, with the growing inequality, we now have an estimated gap between children in the highest and lowest fifths of the social economic distribution of over a standard distribution when they enter in reading and in math. That's when they're entering the schools. And we know that that gap sometimes gets larger when they are in the schools, as well as some schools being able to narrow it. And so I don't think we can just talk about our university in isolation and think about higher ed. As somebody who has devoted my life and my passion to working at K-12 schools, I think that the university has a very important role in terms of thinking about what's happening in those schools, what happens with the students who are coming here. I couldn't be prouder of Brandeis in terms of having the Myra Craft Transitional Year Program and Posse, and taking a leadership role about thinking about how first-generation students who might not necessarily make it into Brandeis in a traditional way, in fact, are able to be here and be successful here. It's not just a matter of having them here, but with thinking about that, and Brandeis really is a model about that. And I also want to pick up about what Lisa said about unionization. You know, when we think about the fact that people are not talking to each other and there's incredible polarization, it occurs to me that the attack on unions, which has been so successful in our country, has taken away a place for people to have a voice, has taken away a place not just for people of color, but white working class folks too, and poor people, who used to be able to go to their union and have somebody, you know, fight for them, basically, and be a voice for them. And that's no longer here in many ways. And I think it's part of the reason why there's such an attack upon teacher unions at this point, because they're one of the few national unions still standing. I say this as a former superintendent of schools. But I really believe in the role of unions. And I believe that if you take away voices from people, if you take away their ability to be able to legitimately talk about what's happening so they don't think it's just a personal failing about whether or not they've made it, when you do that, that's when people despair. And I think we see that despair in the opioid addiction, and I think we see the despair in many other ways. And that's where I think a lot of the anger comes from. So the fact that we are dismissed as being arrogant and looking down on people, and I think we are somewhat guilty about that. But I also think we need to figure out together what we believe should be happening so that people can have a voice.
Great, thank you, Maria. And one of the things I'm hearing is a little bit of people taking slightly different tacks on the question of how much we as universities should just go about our business of doing science, bringing forward the facts, teaching critical thinking, promoting kind of the things we have always done, knowledge in a deep way, and how much we should be going out of our way to attack certain kinds of social and political issues that are either not being addressed or are being undermined in some active way. I'm not sure that's exactly a distinction, but I'm hearing a little bit of people taking somewhat different tacks on that. Mario,
I would push a little bit. I don't think it's going out of our way. I think this is the essence of education, which is that we need to figure out about the injustices that are going on. We need to think about that in our classes. We need to think about that as a university.
Okay, so you're on that side. Arguing it's not out of our way, but it does depend how you might.
I'm going to grab the mic away from you.
You can do it.
That's even more than waving the things. You know what? So let's try in this panel not to try to put people into a simple box. I think that's a big problem of where we are right now. Is everybody's like, which group are you? And I think what universities really do is the best universities, people move across their borders and boundaries and engage in those discussions, and that's where you have the most interesting ideas that come out. And Raj, to your point, this is where if we don't understand how to go across those borders and boundaries, we don't understand the differences amongst ourselves, then we're not going to succeed in having those innovative and important conversations. And that scientific knowledge is not something nerdy, boring, sterile that just sort of sits off in a corner. The best of knowledge coming out of universities should transform a society. So it is not something that is somehow or other removed from the reality of day-to-day life. It very much should shape the day-to-day life of individuals and groups and society.
Won't get an argument from me. I think we've tried to embody that here, but still it comes on a day-to-day way to specific kinds of choices that need to be made. Okay. Angela, is this a wave to respond to something? Oh,
a request.
Okay.
Okay, so I think part of the problem is that this kind of positioning the university as outside society, like an institution that can make decisions whether to do this or to do that. The university is as much a part of the problem, like everything else in society, and inequality is not threatened to the university. The university is responsible for that inequality. And I think that way of asking and framing the questions is at the root of the problem itself. The university has no chance, has no options to be relevant to the future of society if it doesn't change the way it is asking the research questions that ask from the different disciplines, because we cannot, or as universities, we cannot afford not to find what a society needs from the university, as opposed to decide what we can do or not do. Part of the problem is that all of these movements that we are talking about are happening out there, and we are not part of how that's happening, or we are not asking the question of what do they need from the university to be part, to contribute to that transformation. I wonder if the university is ready for knowledge exchange, for instance, not to consider itself the owner of knowledge, but rather a platform for exchanging ways to transform society. I think the university is in a little bit of a big crisis, I don't know, for good reasons. It has, in a way, distanced itself from problems like inequality. I mean, we're part of it. We are not apart. And there is an enormous need to ask radical questions from the university. And that is only possible if we ask them from different disciplines and with the people, not from here to wrap up an answer and put it back in the world. I think the university has been for too long separated from society, taking very comfortable decisions about whether I invite this person or that person. No, I mean, if we were part of society, we will be there talking to the people on whatever side they were, and not, deciding whether to open the door or close the door. Or this is not an institution to exercise power, but rather to, a platform where we need to go there The university needs to go out. And that's done with the best tool that a university has, that is to ask questions, research questions.
Thank you for encouraging us to get out of our usual shell. Okay, I have a little roadmap to getting us to break. Richard has a quick intervention. Then Jay has been very patient through a number of interventions, so I'm going to get to Jay. Then David Chard. Then I'm going to give Jacob the last word from give a student the last word from the panel before I turn it to Lee for some themes from our first half, and then we'll go to a break. So Richard, a brief.
Can we suggest that even if we move to part 2, that we can resuscitate?
Of course. No. The conversation will continue. There will be some extra questions too, but there will definitely. It's expected it all builds.
Yep.
Richard, very briefly.
I just thought I must come back to an issue that was raised by Maria Madison, and that is a burning issue, certainly in South Africa, and that is inequality, and particularly inequality in respect of land. Over centuries, the land of the majority of black people in South Africa was stolen from them. And this is a cancer in the democracy that could prove fatal, and it's a reason that the majority party now, as well as the opposition, one of the main opposition parties, are talking about confiscation of land without compensation. And they want to amend the Constitution to allow for that. In fact, they don't need to amend the Constitution because the Constitution provides that the government can expropriate land in return for reasonable compensation. And it's up to the courts to decide what is reasonable compensation. And to take your example, if some white South African purchased property from, that's in District 6, reasonable compensation, in my view, should be 0, because that person knew that the land that they were acquiring had been stolen from its true owners. And I think one can multiply the examples in their grey areas. But it may be a good idea. President Ramaphosa has called for an inquiry, a commission of inquiry to be set up into the whole question of land restitution. And of course, here the universities can and will play a very important role. One other aspect of the seminar I went to last week in Cape Town, the dean of the law school said that what has shaken her are the number of students from poor homes, from poor areas, who've been granted scholarships and have come to the university to realize how unequal life is. People who've come to the university and realized that their poor education hasn't fitted them for university education. Students who get scholarships but don't have food to eat. They're exposed every day vividly to the inequality of the society in which they live. So here's another huge area, and I'm sure to an extent it applies in all countries, including this one.
Jay Kaufman, one of the things John Shattuck mentioned in terms of talking about resilience was work at the state and local level as a state legislator, also playing a key role in helping us in our ENACT program get students engaged in political life. The floor is yours.
So many things to react to. Let me start by not reacting to that question, but go back to the earlier question that you asked about is, how is it phrased here? To what extent do you view increasing inequality as a threat to democratic values? I cannot overstate how important that is as a threat to democratic values. And de Tocqueville would be the first to recognize this, I think, were he here today, because among other things, he cited the equality of opportunity. And we have anything but equal opportunity. And the growing wealth and income gap is certainly a part of it. The serious threats to mobility, social and economic mobility is certainly part of it. Changing demographics and changing personalities is certainly a big part of it. And I think a closely related aspect of it is the role that money plays in politics, at least in this country. I don't know about in South Africa. But between the two of them, it's a toxic mix, and democracy cannot survive that toxic mix. I work hard to celebrate our resilience, and I'd like to come down on the side of how resilient we are, but I don't think we can survive the kind of inequality that we're experiencing and the impact that has on our political system. Where to go with that? I think a closely related threat that we have is how much fear there is abroad. I don't mean internationally, but abroad in the land. It's a fear that is connected with the change in racial identity. Being a white male these days feels to many white males as being part of a threatened, endangered species. I'm not defending that, by the way. I just want to make clear that I understand. I was not shocked by Trump's victory. I think if you think about some of the changes, and I think, John, you made reference to this, some of the changes that have happened in this country and this world are profoundly threatening to some sort of the dominant narrative that some of us have held dear. On top of that, the small matter of international terrorism, rising sea levels and climate change, we're profoundly threatened as a way of life that we have known is a way of life no more. And it is not unprecedented to go crouch and cover in the face of that level of threat. And so totalitarianism inevitably is one of the reactions to the level of dislocation that we are collectively experiencing. So that brings me to the role of the university. If there's any institution that ought to be conscious of that historically and responsible for the realities of that today, this is it. Given the history of Brandeis, if we're not speaking the truth about some of the dislocation and speaking the truth about the responsibility that we have to handle transitions in a fashion other than reactionary, then no place will do it. So we have, I think, Brandeis in particular, but universities in general, have a serious responsibility to make common cause with others who are willing to speak truth to power, truth unto its innermost parts, including some very painful truths. And I love the citation for de Tocqueville, but I'll offer instead a quote from Mark Twain, who said, "I'm all for progress, it's change I can't stand." We're about serious change, and we're about building a tolerance for not knowing and for transitions and for change. And if we can't do that at the academic, on an academy level, then our society is deprived of one major institution that could be part of the solution. That said, I don't think we can be naive about how much of a challenge we're up against. Lisa, you spoke about the role of science and the role of science. I live in an institution that, this is the the Massachusetts legislature. I have used the term anti-intellectual more than once in my 24 years in the State House. And this is a relatively enlightened state and a relatively enlightened legislature. So what's going on in Washington right now is clearly much worse than anything I've experienced in the State House. But this country doesn't always have, there's a lot of evidence of us not respecting the role of science and the role of truth. And I think we're naive if we don't take that into account too.
David Chard, thank you for taking your time away as a president of a college dedicated to improving the lives of children and families, and in the midst of a sea change in higher education. Your thoughts?
Sure, I'll keep my comments brief, and they build on a number of things others have said. But it seems to me that what John described at the outset of the discontent growing around the world that's either led to our current government or changes in Eastern Europe, that discontent is fundamental to good democracy, right? We have to train people to be discontent, but also discontent with information and discontent with the ability to critique and to have a sense of agency about how to change things. And as a president of a college that has a long legacy of working on the preparation of teachers, I think one of my greatest concerns is not a short-term threat, but a long-term threat to our democracy that we still have a system of teacher preparation that relies on half of the population not having any choices about their career development. We prepared teachers in the 1950s and 60s because women had very few choices, and some of the best became teachers. Today they have, as we all know, very many more options, and we've not shifted our policies to respect that. And we're now beginning to see the fruit of those, I think, of that sort of tragic decision. Part of which in a state like this enlightened state of Massachusetts, where 70% of children of color are not reading on grade level by the 3rd grade, which portends challenges as they move forward through the grades and makes it increasingly difficult for them to be able to access higher education. So I think one of the responsibilities higher education must take is more of a central role in improving public education, and really pre-K through 12, not just K through 12. Because now we're beginning to understand that a lot of what happens even before children enter kindergarten has such a long-term effect on their ability to be successful as adults. So let me stop there.
Great, thank you. From among our discussants, Jacob, I'm going to give you the last word before I turn it back to Lee to give us some of the themes before our break.
Pressure's on. There's a kind of a startling looking map that I think many have seen, which shows sort of the county by county breakdown of the way votes in 2016 fell. And it's, you know, when you cut it up into red and blue, it's startlingly red. It looks like, you know, how in the world can, you know, many of the votes have been, you know, so centralized for Democrats. But I don't think that it would be shocking to discover that, you know, many of those lines find similarity with socioeconomic maps that you can also draw of our population. Back when my father was attending undergraduate, his tuition was $50 per semester at the University of Houston. He was a military brat. He went to, I think, 11 different schools in his 12 years. And his family wasn't the most well off because of much of that. But just recently I was reading an article in the Boston Globe about the new $70,000 per year college education. And I would bet my last dollar, which if you want to go get it, I bet it's upstairs in the Office of Financial Services. I would bet that it's going to be soon an $80,000 college education. It's gone up quite a lot since you know, I've gotten to Brandeis, since my sister went to college just a few years ago. And so that, to me, begs the question of what is the ultimate goal of institutions of higher education? Is it to serve only those who are able to be present on the campus because of the affordability of being here, because they are able to make it here? Or is it to sort of achieve the larger end of the production of knowledge and allowing others to acquire knowledge, to which I would agree, and I would say that leads to maybe the necessity of colleges and universities in the future to place a much greater emphasis on reaching outward and expanding outward into our communities and into those areas which, going back to the map, may not be touched very much by the influence of colleges and universities. In my very deep blue part of the state, which I grew up in, it was assumed that almost everybody from my town, from my high school, would be going to college. And I bet that for every school like mine, there's a school where it's the expectation of almost nobody that they're going to be going to college. So in order to sort of meet the challenge being posed by inequality in our country, It's up to colleges and universities to use the influence, use the resources, use our mission of creating and passing on knowledge in the areas which we are increasingly unable to reach because of these socioeconomic barriers.
Thank you. Wow, a powerful list of things we at Brandeis and colleges and universities should be doing more of. Although it is a challenge, one of the things that Brandeis is encountering now is that as a university, we've added always more and more things that we think we have to do, and they're usually good things. And our new president is telling us we have to be a little more disciplined about which things we take on. So it'll be an interesting question about how we prioritize all of these important things that we need to do. Lee, can you help make us a little sense from that microphone there, and then we'll take a break.
Okay, this is going to be my attempt on the fly to just bring up some of the threads that I heard. So I want to start by using this image that John Shattuck brought up of frontiers of democracy, because I think it really works well to synthesize some of this really wide-ranging set of remarks that have been made. So when we think about frontiers, we usually think about sort of the frontward line of something, that there's always a frontier moving forward. And I think John has reminded us that frontiers also can regress. There can be a retrenchment. And that is what he mentioned in Eastern Europe. But it also seems, with his idea of resilience, and other people have brought this up, that some frontiers are more like rubber bands. They might be momentarily stretched, but they might want to return to their original place. So they might be stretched backward with a retrenchment, but I wouldn't say they would snap back like a rubber band, but there might be some sort of elastic memory that means that they want to go back to some sort of stable moment. But I want to push this idea of frontiers sort of semantically, because it has another meaning in English, which means boundary or border. And that's, of course, what we hear in Romance languages, frontera in Spanish and frontière. It means a border. So I want to synthesize some of the other remarks that have to do about this idea of what is encompassed by the idea of democracy, and what's encompassed, what's inside the border of what universities can do. So let me just come up with a couple of remarks. That there was a number of things, a number of remarks that brought up some of the same ideas. First of all, this idea of frontiers or borders of democracy, what this democracy, the sense of democracy, should encompass. And it should include both majority and minority views and experiences. And I'm just trying to look at my scrawls here. Knowing the views of a wide range of subpopulations in a society is an important part of democracy, but also that those should not just be accepted, that there should be critical thinking when listening to different kinds of views, and that there are views that have a different philosophical or ideological bent shouldn't just be accepted, but there's also a truth factor, that there are facts out there, and so we shouldn't just blindly listen to the other side without subjecting it to some sort of evaluation. I thought there was a very interesting idea about that we need to question the idea of democracy itself, that it just shouldn't be a romantic notion that it's accepted 100%, that this is something that we need to be going for, without actually questioning what the content is of that concept and how it can change over time or across space. Now, about the frontiers or the borders of universities, I know we're going to get to this more in the second part, but let me just bring up some of the interesting ideas that were recurring. There's this idea that within universities that there needs to be the ability to cross philosophies, cross ideologies, cross disciplines, and to be doing that in kind of a safe space where we can start to question some of the larger issues in society. Somebody brought up the idea that that there needs to be a balance struck between the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of justice, that we need, in a way, to revolutionize the way that we're thinking about the very missions of our higher education institutions. The borders on campus, the frontiers of democracy on campus might need to include a sort of instruction or mentorship to our students about what it means to be a democratic participant, the importance of voting. Do we actually, we in the academy need to be leading and persuading our students to do what they need to do to become full citizens and responsible citizens. I think there's a very interesting set of remarks that were about what universities should do to, in a way, contextualize what is happening right now in our larger society. We need to bring in a historical depth so that we understand that there are certain kind of patterns that may lead to reactions like totalitarianism, and we at universities are well positioned to be reminding the larger public that history recurs, and we can in some way anticipate some sort of reactions because we have a way to look back and to put this in historical context. At the same time, let me see, I had a comment here. At the same time, we in universities should not be afraid to not know the answer. So in a way that we could say that we have the ability to know answers, but also that we should be asking questions that about matters and issues that maybe there is no answer to. And I think the whole idea about the connection of universities to the larger society and to these trends that we're seeing is very, very interesting, that we shouldn't be telling the larger society to do. We should be asking questions. We should be forging partnerships. We should be working in concert with the larger society, and not sort of pull back into an elite and intellectual space, but also be doing our part to understand and to be a partner in creating effective responses to some of the challenges that we have right now. So I think that's about it, and I hope that we can go on the second part and move on.
Great. That's a great job, Lee. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. It's a good first half. We'll reconvene at 4 o'clock for a shorter second half that will also give some chance for folks in the audience to participate. Thank you.